So when you go to a therapist, there's some action that the therapist wants us to take that will improve our lives, whether it's to think about the world more adaptively, whether to work on intimate relationships, to understand and express our emotions. There's lots of different things that psychotherapists do, but all of these things are health promoting. So our therapist helps us do things that are good for us.
Welcome to the Become Your Own Therapist podcast, the podcast where I try to put myself out of a job as a clinical psychologist. Today we have Professor Bruce E. Wampold on the podcast. He was trained in mathematics before earning his doctorate in counseling psychology. He's a professor emeritus of counseling psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and chief scientist at Skillsetter Incorporated. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and board certified in counseling psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology. Currently, his work involves understanding counseling and psychotherapy from empirical, historical, and anthropological perspectives, which has led to the development of a contextual model from which to understand the benefits of counseling and psychotherapy. As well, he has explored social healing in various contexts, including placebos, medicines, psychotherapy, and various cultural healing practices. His work is summarized in the Great Psychotherapy Debate, which we'll touch on today, as well as numerous articles and chapters. He's the recipient of the 2007 Distinguished Professional Contributions to Applied Research Award from the APA, the 2015 Distinguished Research Career Award from the Society for Psychotherapy Research, and the 2019 Gold Medal Award for Life Achievement in the Application of Psychology from the American Psychological Foundation. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I'm delighted. It'd be an interesting conversation, and I look forward to it.
Yes, me too. So I think part of the reason why I invited you on is because I read your work through my training as a clinical psychologist, and you had very clear and interesting ideas on what makes psychotherapy work. What's that? Where is the magic happening? Exactly. And I think, for a lay audience, which is mostly the audience listening, I think it's probably relevant for them not to just, go to a psychotherapist or engage in psychotherapy, but to actually understand what's the mechanism happening here, and also for us to explore to what degree these things apply outside of the psychotherapist's office, which I know you've written on, because you've written on various contexts. So, I think maybe a good place to start is what makes psychotherapy work, which is a big question, but a bit of an unfair one, but I'd be happy to hear.
Well, a very fair one, but a complex one. So, psychotherapy works not in just one simple way. So it's a complex phenomenon. But what psychotherapy is, in my study of this, primarily a social means for making changes in one's life. So you meet with a psychotherapist, and it isn't some secret kind of innovative treatment they have, but it's this meeting with somebody, first of all, who is understanding, curious about you, empathic, and caring. So often when we, or typically when we suffer from some kind of mental distress or psychological problems, we feel lonely and isolated. Often we rejected by others or stigmatized. And even if not, even if our family and friends understand and want to help us, they often don't really fully understand why we can't just overcome these difficulties on our own. So there's this understanding person who, the contract is that this person's going to meet us regularly, like once a week. And no matter what we say, with some exceptions, but no matter what we say, this person's there again for us the next session in a way that's understanding. That's a tremendously powerful force. We know things like smoking and excessive drinking, lack of exercise are all behavioral aspects that are dangerous for us. They lead to poor health and even risk for death. But more powerful in terms of risk is loneliness. Okay, so the one thing psychotherapy does is it gives us somebody to be able to talk to who makes an effort to understand us and genuinely cares for us. So number one. Number two, gives us a plan for overcoming these difficulties. As you know, Nevern, there's all kinds of different psychotherapies. What they all have in common is that there's some coherent, understandable, and convincing plan for what we're going to do to overcome these difficulties. So when you go to a therapist, there's some action that the therapist wants us to take that will improve our lives, whether it's to think about the world more adaptively, whether to work on intimate relationships, to understand and express our emotions. There's lots of different things that psychotherapists do, but all of these things are health promoting. So our therapist helps us do things that are good for us. And it's very powerful because the therapist has this socially sanctioned aspect that convinces us to do things that we might have been afraid to do or that we weren't really motivated to do. And so that's another aspect of therapy that makes it. So there's the reduction of loneliness, this person that cares for you, but also induces to do some things that are healthy and health promoting.
Yeah, I was quite amazed when I saw the literature on how detrimental loneliness is to our, actually not just our mental health, but our physical health as well. And I've heard you speak about that as well and write about that. And for the audience listening, why is loneliness so dangerous?
Well, it's an evolved aspect. I mean, humans are the ultimate social animal, right? It's interesting if you look at evolution, the growth of the human brain is an interesting topic because animals want to conserve calories. Our most expensive organ in terms of calorie consumption is our brain. So we evolved this large brain primarily to manage social interactions. The study of primates, the bigger the social network, the larger the brain needs to be, okay? Because managing social networks is tremendously complicated, as we all well known. But the evolutionary fitness to this is that we rely on others. Humans can't survive just by ourselves. So we're this animal that uses these intricate social networks to survive. So we need to be able to manage this. So when you're lonely, it's really a sign that you don't have others that are there to help you when you need them. And that's dangerous.
And how much of it is down to perceived loneliness, the feeling of lacking in your social network versus having no one around you?
It's actually interesting. It is the perceived loneliness that seems to be the strongest predictor of ill health and mortality. So this idea, if I feel lonely and I feel like there's nobody there. So we know people who have friends, who have family, but they feel isolated nevertheless. That's dangerous.
Okay.
So again, one thing psychotherapy does is it provides somebody that not just listens to you, but listens to you and your problems. So we know that you might have friends, and you go to your friends and you say, "Hey, I feel depressed. I can't get out of bed in the morning," and they just, "Well, just get up in the morning. You just gotta have the willpower to get over it." So it's kind of this dismissal, or it could be worse. Never. How many times have you heard people say that? Could be worse. I know people who are depressed and lost their job. You have a good job, so buck up and so therapist listens and understands the difficulties people are having.
So I mean, this, I guess this is where the exploration comes in, because this idea of to what degree it's possible to become your own therapist and help your own suffering is one I'm trying to explore with people in the field. And so in terms of that, so far, what it's sounding to me like is that you could get some traction in terms of providing that sort of healing context even if you aren't able to afford therapy or see a therapist, given that you find yourself in relationships where there's some sort of validation or some sort of empathizing with the other's experience. Would you say that's possible, or is it something that you specifically have to be a therapist for to provide that sort of context?
Well, I don't want to discount the effects of therapy. I mean, therapists are particularly trained to be able to use this relationship in therapy to really help the patient. But we can understand much of how people change and how people feel relief from distress from what we know about therapy. We know, and I listened to John Norcross's interview with you, and he's an expert on this, that many people make changes through self-help, through their own efforts, through reading books. We have all kinds of computer apps now. And there are some commonalities among all those procedures, and John talked about that in a very eloquent way. There's part of this that I want to discuss, and that is this notion of what we call social contagion. It's interesting. It grew out of a study of cardiac events in a large population. And what they found is that physical health and mental health actually spread through social networks. So obesity, if you have obese friends, you're more likely to become obese yourself. And it's this spread through the social networks called social contagion. So we know that you can, especially during the COVID pandemic, you catch disease from being in close proximity to other people. Well, it turns out that mental health and other physical health also spread through close contact with friends and coworkers and so forth. So when you understand that your friends have the habits of your friends and the mental health of your friends have a large influence on you, you start to think about, well, what kind of social network do I need in order to be healthy? So we know if you have some problems with addiction, being in a social network where people drink or use drugs is particularly dangerous. But it's not just addictions, it's depression, it's anxiety, it's a multitude of different characteristics that spread through these social networks. So it's really important for people to think about with whom they associate and with whom the influence is positive. Now, I'm not saying, just go out, get rid of all your old friends and get some new friends, but it is important to think about the influence that your social network has on your mental health.
That's fascinating. Is it causal? Is it the actual influence from these social networks that was measured, or could that be like a third variable, just like the fact that something is shared in the context between those friends?
No, well, they've done very sophisticated research on this, and it's very clearly causal. They rule out various other factors in a very convincing way. This idea of social contagions is quite powerful. So it's interesting. There's a book called I got to remember the name of it. I'll look it up for you before we go. But
Sure.
It's a kind of a layperson's description of this social contagion, and I think the subtitle is how your friends, and your friends' friends determine everything you think, feel, and act. So.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'd love to. Even if it's after the discussion, you're welcome to email it to me.
Yeah, I'll send you a picture of it.
Okay, great. Yeah. I mean,
so the important thing is to realize that this really has an effect on us. So in terms of politics, in terms of our view of the world, but again, also in terms of our mental health, our distress, our habits, and so forth.
And it also gets me thinking in terms of the other way around, not just being the receiver of all these social influences, but also being the sender. What are you sending out? And in terms of loneliness, what? And I know we're in maybe in uncharted territory, but. Is there anything that you can say, from the science that about relating, and these sorts of healing contexts? Is there anything that you can say about what people should be doing for each other to provide a context where this loneliness is minimized rather than exacerbated?
Well, again, this is a very interesting topic, right? Often people are not very good at being friends, right? They're fun to be with, but when the going gets tough, when I'm distressed, it's more difficult to be there in a supportive way without being judgmental or without being really full of advice. Right? We're so good at giving advice. You should do this, or I did this, or my friend did this, and just listen. The power of being present and just listening without wanting to jump in. It's a good instinct. We want to help our friends, so advice is what we think of when we do that. And Nevern, as training to be a psychologist, one of the things you have to give up is this need to provide advice, right? And to sit back and listen and to understand and to show caring. So I would encourage people to think about how they relate to their friends and loved ones in terms of or in times of distress. There are programs where we can teach these skills to the general public. The primary places in couples communication. So there's programs for how to have good communication with your partner. And really what it involves is this kind of active listening. And I like to think of it as curiosity. You want to understand what someone's going through. It's a very powerful concept that we just want to be curious about each other without jumping on and giving simple solutions.
But I've always found this fascinating, and you're absolutely right. It's so instinctual to give advice, and as a psychologist in training, it's you have to learn how to undo that almost, to hold your tongue, and I've always wondered, what do you think it is about this curiosity that just being curious and just that active listening. What do you think it is about that provides such a powerful context for healing?
Well, again, it comes back to this idea that we're social animals, so we depend on each other. Perceived loneliness is, as you mentioned, the key variable. We can be in close contact with people. We can be often involved in various ways. But if the relationships are not one where you feel like you're heard, you're respected, you're cared for, all the people in the world isn't going to be helpful. It needs to be this kind of curious, caring, understanding stance. These are skills we can learn. We can teach and learn these skills. And, the idea of your podcast is how do we make changes without therapy? Well, one of the ways we can do it is to help each other learn how to be caring, understanding, and curious individuals with each other. And it's not just friends, it's co-workers, it's people we meet, just the reflection about how we interact with people at the grocery store or at other places where there are strangers. There are people that do research on this, and we have to think about these are other individuals who may be lonely, who may be suffering, and to treat them with respect and caring, regardless of who they are.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds idyllic to me, and I think that's part of the reason why I started this podcast, is because it feels like there are a lot of gems scattered, across our literature that people are actually totally unaware of, or don't even, have no way of accessing in their own lives, and I think building on this, I know of some people who are very skeptical of this idea that this sort of caring and being there, just active listening, that this sort of stuff can create, real change. So these are the people who are a bit more of you have to rise and grind or pull yourself up by the bootstraps, or that's very soft. This sounds very soft to a portion of my audience, maybe even. What would you say to that portion who, for this sounds a bit soft?
Yes. Well, I've been criticized for being soft-headed.
Oh.
we in psychotherapy, we need these really important active ingredients and this relationship stuff. Well, that's well enough, good and well enough, but we need something more specific. Well, I'll say to those people, the science behind social relationships and its importance for thriving is solid. The people who study social contagion are extremely sophisticated. The people that study the neuroscience of social relationships are extremely sophisticated. People that study placebos and how placebos become effective to a large extent through the interaction of the healer and the patient. This is all rigorous research, and why the social aspects of it should be discounted as soft is beyond me. Okay, we've studied in the United States, the National Institute of Mental Health spent billions of dollars looking for biomarkers and the neuroscience substrate and the genetics of mental illness with almost no effect on outcomes because they've ignored the social aspects of this. Okay, we think individually often in terms of disease. There's something wrong with the organism. Mental health is not a disease of the organism. It's a disease of the social network. And we have to remember how important that is. Even schizophrenia, the current guidelines in schizophrenia are medication, but they also realize that the social context is absolutely critical. Acceptance by the family, employment, engagement in the community are absolute keys to managing psychotic disorders.
Yeah, and I think this is where I found your work really interesting. This sort of contextual model that you're mapping out now versus the medical, this biomedical model of human suffering, and is that sort of medicalization of human suffering? Is that disempowering in any way? Do you think to the average person?
Well, I don't know if it's disempowering, but clearly some conditions have some biological basis to them. So I don't want to say we shouldn't do investigations and we shouldn't advance the science and understanding of how the brain works and how the genes influence behavior and so forth. But it's the ignoring of the social aspects that's really held the field back. You think in the last 30 or 40 years, the prevalence of mental disorders has been increasing in almost every country. So how is this? If we're making progress, the prevalence of mental illness is increasing. Part of it is, we're building societies with increased stress and increased social isolation. I mean, the pandemic has just exacerbated that tremendously. We're working at home and we don't go out, we don't socialize in the same ways. But it's more than just the pandemic. It's the way we're building society and the pressures that come from employers and the social media and so forth. We forget how important society and social institutions are for mental health. And so both for the treatment of mental health and for the encouragement of good mental health, we should be emphasizing social relationships.
Yeah. So it's not so much of taking away any research or money put into investigating the biological bases of these things, but just adding this social understanding of the importance of that. Yeah.
I would take away some money from the biological basis because it's just, I think, misguided when we understand how important the social aspects. I mean, psychotherapy is a social healing practice, and it's remarkably effective. Just sitting with a therapist for an hour a week is as effective as the best medications for anxiety and depression, for instance. I mean, that illustrates how important this is. And again, psychotherapy is not the only way. We need to encourage better social relationships. We need to help educate people about social relationship, learn the skills that are helpful. Helping other people also helps ourselves. So it isn't just I need to learn these skills so I can be a better friend and my friends will have better mental health. It's also something that's really gratifying for the person who expresses this. Sometimes when I remember to be kind to somebody who's under a lot of stress, somebody who's got a job, and I'm talking to them on the phone, and everybody is angry at them because their flights have been canceled, to say something nice and supportive and understanding of how difficult their job is, not only is a benefit to them, it's a benefit to me. I feel better after I do that.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think I've seen or read somewhere that in certain circumstances, it's actually there's more impact on a person's well-being when they're actually giving out the kindness or the gratitude or something. Is that true?
Yeah, there is research on that in the positive psychology.
Okay.
Yeah. So, it's easier said than done. We all have stress in our life. We all have issues we're dealing with. I don't want to make it sound like just go out and be nice to people and the world's going to be better. It's a bit more complicated than that.
Sure. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's quite a big question, but if you just building on this, the world being, better, whatever that means, if you were ruler of the earth, I don't know how to phrase this, but if you were, you had unlimited resources and you had a lot of power in terms of where this funding, like you said, you would take away funding from, some of the biological stuff. But what would be your first, act as this leader of global mental health? If you had the power and the money, what would you do to help the world and this increasing prevalence of mental disorders?
Well, I think we have to take a look at how various social institutions and cultural practices are kind of being under assault of our technological world, and how we can ensure that there's support for the social relationships. I mean, we need a minister of social relationships in every country. Okay. So, the Nordic countries do a really envious job of building social relationships. They have parental leave when you have a child. It's quite generous, and that's building social relationships, right? So the developing child particularly is in need of those social relationships. There's a limit about the number of hours you work in a day, because we know going home and having dinner with your family is extremely important. So there are policies we can put into place that really encourage social relationships.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you know how much parental leave in general these places get?
Well, it depends on the situation, but 6 months to a year for each parent.
Wow.
Yeah. I know the American audiences are going to go, well, I had 6 minutes.
Yeah, I think the South African audience will agree. My previous landlords, they had a child recently, and I think the man in the relationship, I think he got 3 days. hopefully.
And by the way, this is paid leave, not just you get your job back at the end, but it's actually paid leave.
Wow. Yeah, that
So,
is amazing.
I mean, essentially, they're investing in the future of these societies by investing in children's development. And we all know that's where it starts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's also a critical stage of development. Uh-huh. So, okay. So you would put a lot more emphasis on being intentional about managing the disruptions to these social relations, the cultural practices, how technological advancements are influencing all of that. Um, what have you seen in the past, few years that you've been researching and just being a human being? What have you noticed in terms of these disruptions of social networks? And you mentioned technological advancements sort of disrupting that as well. Is there anything that sticks out to you?
Well, I know the United States most intimately because this is where I live, but increased pressures at work to produce, more social isolation at work, even before the pandemic. Social media, of course, the research on the effects of social media and social relationships is a bit mixed, but we got to be really careful that we use social media in a way that's constructive for ourselves rather than isolating. Having 3,000 followers on Twitter or so many friends on Facebook is not a guarantee that we don't feel lonely. Okay. Again, it's not the number of friends or contacts you have. It's how those relationships take place that are important.
I think we should get Facebook to add a perceived friends count.
Yeah. Perceived loneliness. And the other phenomena, of course, everyone knows. We all put a profile that looks like we're the happiest people in the world, right? Because nobody wants to be friends with somebody who's depressed or suffering. And again, that's unfortunate that we only seem to want to be friends with and present ourselves as just doing really well. When all of us at different periods in our lives suffer from some kind of distress, and we need friends who are understanding, friends and family who are understanding, and curious and just there for us in that way.
Yeah. And so I have a question that's sort of adjacent to this, and it just came to mind now because I remembered you saying, you said like we have some people who have this sort of, come on, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You just got to keep going, and that's the way they relate to people. It's very advice oriented, not really listening. It just came to mind that I have clients who say that about themselves. So it's not even, someone else saying it to them. Is that something that, and I don't know if this is exactly your area, but is that something that also plays a role in terms of, just being a bit more understanding of yourself? Can that sort of interpersonal dynamic play out with just your relationship to yourself, or is that totally different?
Well, people incorporate cultural values. So they think about, well, I'm distressed, I have problems, I go to see a psychologist. It's because I have a lack of willpower. If I just pulled myself up by my bootstraps, I could get over this. And it's more complicated than that, isn't it? It's having adequate strategies for overcoming difficulties. I mean, People grow up in traumatic childhoods. Terrible things have happened to them. I mean, some of the patients I've seen, Efren, I think about the courage that they have to face these problems when the way they have been treated and the experiences in their lives are absolutely devastating. And yet there they are sitting with you, wanting to do better. And what you provide them is some way to do that. It isn't just listening and caring, but it's also the providing of strategies for overcoming these difficulties to do something that's different. So yes, as psychologists, we don't want to just give simple advice about how to do this, but we are experts in developing strategies for overcoming these difficulties.
And what are some of those strategies? Because I know you're saying, it's not just the social relationship, it's the relationship, it's having a clear sort of rationale and the expectations around that, and then also, but that third element of the doing things that are healthy.
Well, Nevern, you know as a psychologist how many treatments there are. What are the 400 or 500 different kinds? But what they all have in common is some reasonable procedures for developing coping strategies or learning ways to deal with the problems I don't know what your orientation is, but cognitive behavioral therapists think about the world more adaptively and change your outlook and the way you attribute events in life. Psychodynamic therapists are going to work with the expression of affect and not avoiding the difficult affects. So interpersonal therapists work on interpersonal relationships, on and on and on. It doesn't really matter exactly which of these strategies it is, but it's the empowerment you get from having some means to do things differently in your life in a more constructive and adaptive way.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, I agree with that. I was trained quite integratively. So we did CBT, psychodynamic, systemic, existential, lots of breadth, but it, to get to depth in that 2 years of training is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, yeah, sure, go for it.
Well, it occurred to me that we live in a technological world, and so the idea is, what can you do besides psychotherapy? A number of people are trying to look at different ways of using technology to provide kind of relief. So there's peer support. So instead of getting a psychologist, maybe a specially trained non-professional just to talk to periodically when you need someone to talk to. Another group is doing what I kind of think of as vicarious therapy. You can't access therapy yourselves, but you could listen to other people like you getting therapy. So there's all kinds of innovative ways using technology. So I don't want to say, well, let's go back to the old days where we sit around the fire in the evening, and talk to each other and listen to each other.
Yeah.
Well, things are changing. So there are non-traditional psychotherapy using electronic means, but they're all centered on this idea that we need some human interaction, which is a very powerful way to make changes. Again, as John Norcross said, not the only way, right? People read books, self-help books, and make changes. But what's interesting about that is we often have this image of somebody there. So it's not just the book telling us, but the author and the kind of imagined person, which is a powerful act. So we know even in internet applications like internet CBT, the alliance with the program and with the supposed therapist there makes a difference. So again, it's the perceived human relationship that's a very powerful force behind change.
Great. Yeah, well, I just want to thank you, Bruce, for introducing, such a thoughtful and empirical perspective on what makes psychotherapy work. And I know, John was speaking about lots of, other sorts of alternatives, but I think your perspective here is really valuable for people to know. So thank you for being on. And I want to check in if you have any concluding remarks for a lay audience who are looking to ease their own suffering.
Well, again, first I want to thank you for the invitation. It's always important to talk about these topics, and I think the more information we provide to the public, the better. In the United States, we get all these ads for drugs on TV where it's legal to advertise drugs. Nobody gets on the TV and says, hey, psychotherapy is really good for you. You should seek this out. So that's important to have that opportunity. Again, give some attention to our social relationships and providing as well as receiving, because we want to have reciprocal relationships where people are there for us when we need it, and we're there for them when they need it. And that, I think, is the key to reducing a lot of suffering, if we would just attend to the human relationships.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to put that into action in my own life. I hope those listening to this will do that as well. And thanks again for being here today.
Thanks very much, Nevern.
Okay, great.